If I have any more of your interference with their conditioning, I'll send for the porters and have you thrown out." The savage rose to his feet and took a couple of steps towards her. His movements and the expression on his face were so menacing that the nurse fell back in terror. With a great effort, he checked himself and, without speaking, turned away and sat down again by the bed. Reassured, but with a dignity that was a trifle shrill and uncertain, "I've warned you," said the nurse, "so mind." Still, she led the two inquisitive twins away and made them join in the game of Hunt the Zipper, which had been organized by one of her colleagues at the other end of the room. "Run along now and have your cup of caffeine solution, dear," she said to the other nurse. The exercise of authority restored her confidence, made her feel better. "Now, children," she called. Linda had stirred uneasily, had opened her eyes for a moment, looked vaguely around, and then once more dropped off to sleep. Sitting beside her, the savage tried hard to recapture his mood of a few minutes before. A, B, C, vitamin D, he repeated to himself, as though the words were a spell that would restore the dead past to life. But the spell was ineffective. Obstinately, the beautiful memories refused to rise. There was only a hateful resurrection of jealousies and ugliness and miseries. Pope, with the blood trickling down from his cut shoulder, and Linda hideously asleep, and the flies buzzing round the spilt mescal on the floor beside the bed, and the boys calling those names as she passed. Ah, no, no. He shut his eyes. He shook his head in strenuous denial of these memories. A, B, C, vitamin D. He tried to think of those times where he sat on her knees and she put her arms about him and sang over and over again, rocking him to sleep. A, B, C, vitamin D, vitamin D, vitamin D. The Supervox Verlitzeriana had risen to a sobbing crescendo, and suddenly the verbena gave place, in the scent circulating system, to an intense patchouli. Linda stirred, woke up, stared for a few seconds bewilderedly at the semifinalist, then, lifting her face, sniffed once or twice at the newly perfumed air, and suddenly smiled. A smile of childish ecstasy. "Pope," she murmured and closed her eyes. "Oh, I do so like it. I do." She sighed and let herself sink back into the pillows. "But Linda," the savage spoke imploringly, "don't you know me?" He had tried so hard, had done his very best. Why wouldn't she allow him to forget? He squeezed her limped hand, almost with violence, as though he would force her to come back from the dream of ignoble pleasures, from these base and hateful memories, back into the present, back into reality. The appalling present, the awful reality, but sublime, but significant, but desperately important precisely because of the imminence of that which made them so fearful. "Don't you know me, Linda?" He felt the faint answering pressure of her hand. The tears started into his eyes. He bent over her and kissed her. Her lips moved. "Pope," she whispered again, and it was as though he had a pail full of ordure thrown in his face. Anger suddenly boiled up in him, balked for the second time. The passion of his grief had found another outlet, was transformed into a passion of agonized rage. "But I'm John!" he shouted. "I'm John!" And in his furious misery, he actually caught her by the shoulder and shook her. Linda's eyes fluttered open, and she saw him, knew him. John! But situated the real face, the real and violent hands, in an imaginary world among the inward and private equivalents of patchouli and super Wurlitzer among the transfigured memories and the strangely transposed sensations that constituted the universe of her dream. She knew him for John, her son, but fancied him an intruder into that paradisal Malpai, where she had been spending her summer holiday with Pope. He was angry because she liked Pope. He was shaking her because Pope was there in the bed, as though there was something wrong, as though all civilized people didn't do the same. Everyone belongs to her voice suddenly died into an almost inaudible, breathless croaking. Her mouth fell open. She made a desperate effort to fill her lungs with air, but it was as though she had forgotten how to breathe. She tried to cry out, but no sound came. Only the terror of her staring eyes revealed what she was suffering. Her hands went to her throat and clawed at the air she could no longer breathe, the air that for her had ceased to exist. The savage was on his feet, bent over her. What is it, Linda? What is it? His voice was imploring. It was as though he were begging to be reassured. The look she gave him was changed, with an unspeakable terror, with terror and, it seemed to him, reproach. She tried to raise herself in bed, but fell back onto the pillows. Her face was horribly distorted, her lips blue. The savage turned and ran up the ward. Quick, quick, he shouted, quick! Standing at the center of a ring of zipper hunting twins, the head nurse looked round. The first moment's astonishment gave place almost instantly to disapproval. Don't shout. Think of the little ones, she said, frowning. You might decondition. But what are you doing? He had broken through the ring. Be careful, a child was yelling. Quick, quick! He caught her by the sleeve, dragging her after him. Quick, something's happened. I've killed her. By the time they were back at the end of the ward, Linda was dead. The savage stood for a moment in frozen silence, then fell on his knees beside her bed, and covering his face with his hands, sobbed uncontrollably. The nurse stood irresolute, looking now at the kneeling figure by the bed, the scandalous exhibition, and now, poor children, at the twins who had stopped their hunting of the zipper and were staring from the other end of the ward, staring with all their eyes and nostrils at the shocking scene that was being enacted around bed 20. Should she speak to him? Try to bring him back to a sense of decency? Remind him of where he was, of what fatal mischief he might do to these poor innocents? Undoing all their wholesome death conditioning with this disgusting outcry, as though death were something terrible, as though anyone mattered as much as all that. It might give them the most disastrous ideas about the subject, might upset them into reacting in the entirely wrong, the utterly antisocial way. She stepped forward. She touched him on the shoulder. Can't you behave? She said in a low, angry voice, but looking round, she saw that half a dozen twins were already on their feet and advancing toward the ward. The circle was disintegrating. In another moment, no, the risk was too great. The whole group might be put back 6 or 7 months in its conditioning. She hurried back towards the menaced charges. Now who wants a chocolate eclair? She asked in a loud, cheerful tone. Me! Yelled the entire Balkanovsky group in a chorus. Bed 20 was completely forgotten. Oh God, God, God! The savage kept repeating to himself in the chaos of grief and remorse that filled his mind. It was the one articulate word. God, he whispered in aloud. God! Whatever is he saying? Said a voice very near, distinct, and shrill through the warblings of the super Wurlitzer.